They were chasing a guy with the colorful name of Tricky Riggle out of Wheatland.
That's the voice of Kirk Knox.
And he eliminated a couple of people in the café up there one Saturday.
If Kirk sort of sounds like a radio announcer or really confident on the mic, that's because he was. Actually, he was a journalist on the radio who got his start in newspapers.
I said, well, I'm not too crazy about going up there to look for this guy if they're going to have a posse with a pen and a piece of paper. So I took the rifle. I figured, well, geez, if somebody's going to be shooting, maybe I should want to be shooting too. So
it's a Wyoming story when a posse is being called up, and that posse is being called up only about a year and a half before Father Knows Best is about to premiere on national TV. Frankly, it's even more of a Wyoming story when a journalist who would start reporting on local TV soon borrows a rifle as he joined the posse. So what was happening in Wheatland, Wyoming, population around 2,200 in 1953? We asked Robin Everett.
I was born and raised in Wheatland. I never remembered anybody ever talking about it growing up or afterwards until I brought it up, and then everybody said, oh yeah, don't you remember?
On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, in which we interview everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, we all go back to remember what happened on this tiny town's main street that gave birth to a posse and is still argued to have had an impact on Wyoming's 1958 gubernatorial election. Here's Robin.
Okay, Tricky Riggle, he was born in Woodbine, Iowa. He came out west shortly before he graduated from high school because he wanted something different. He wanted to be a cowboy.
Tricky Riggle was born in 1900, so the idea of him coming west to become a cowboy wasn't a complete pipe dream. In fact, by the time he got here, Buffalo Bill Cody, also from Iowa, hadn't died many years before.
He wanted to be, the guy on the horse that was out there performing and doing things.
Unlike a lot of us who dream of becoming cowboys or astronauts or dolphin trainers or whatever, this kid from Iowa, whose parents had died before he was much into his adult years, actually began to fulfill his dreams.
He was part of Lucille Mulholland, I believe is her last name, her rodeo act.
In fact, several news accounts from as early as 1936 from places like Lawton, Oklahoma to Wichita Falls, Texas, mention Tricky Riggle having an established side-splitting rodeo act.
He's out doing tricks. He's got a 3-legged horse that he worked with in that rodeo. He got his nickname Tricky because he was a trick roper.
Though we now call them in America bullfighters, at the time he would have been called a rodeo clown and was apparently pretty good at it. A 1940 article from Chickasaw, Oklahoma said that a rodeo bull chased Riggle up a light pole and that it was thrilling. For some reason, this guy who aspired to be one of the icons of the American West also fell victim to some of the tropes that were also part of the West. In this case, an encounter with a sheriff in a bar when Riggle had a gun.
The county sheriff hollered at him or did something, and he turned around and pulled a gun and shot at him in the Top Hat bar. No, he didn't hit him, but they charged him with, I believe, felonious assault or assault of an officer, and he ended up spending about 16 months in the state pen.
After completing his sentence, Tricky went back to Wheatland.
In 1952, is when he met Frances, and she was part of a knife-throwing act for him at the rodeo.
I don't know if someone shoots at a cop if he should be allowed to throw knives at people for a living, but I guess it was a different time. I actually found an ad for the Ritz Theater in an Oklahoma newspaper, and one of the acts mentioned was Tricky Riggle. Above his name, the ad also mentioned something about human targets with Francis Bushman. At first glance, I thought maybe that was the same Francis he was throwing knives at. It turns out that Human Targets was actually a Western with Buzz Barton, and Tricky was just going to perform his act on stage either before the movie, after the movie, during the intermission, something like that. The Francis on the ad was actually a man named Francis, and he was one of the actors in the film. So back to Frances Williamson, the woman Tricky met in Wheatland.
They became good friends, and according to Tricky, they were supposed to get married. In fact, that was what was going to happen, according to him. He was going to pick her up at the Top Hat bar, and they were going to drive to Lusk, which is where her family is from, and they were going to get married the next day.
Remember the Top Hat Bar was where Riggle had tried to shoot or at least scare a sheriff?
When he went to pick her up at the bar, he found that she had been drinking with other people that were already there, and he felt that he was being ignored and told Walter Ackerblade, who was one of the people that Frances had been drinking with, to leave Frances alone. Supposedly they had an altercation there, and then he left to go home. From what I understand, he went home to get his rifle. And while he left to go home, they went across the street to get something to eat. And then I'm going to assume that he went back to the bar, found him not there, and then went over to the cafe to find out what was going on.
One thing that really messes with me about this story is the fact that when you look at a postcard of Wheatland, Wyoming from the 1950s, it's beautiful. It looks like classic Americana with nice cars in Kodachrome, and it's everything you would want in a small town. But then the horror and the violence we think of as being just a product of our own time appeared at the cafe in the form of a trick roper with a rumored temper.
He throws open the door and says, "I told you I'd shoot you." And that's about the time that Walter stood up and started walking towards him, and he fired off some shots off of his rifle and shot Walter, and then he turned and shot Frances. After he shot them both, he turned around, got in his car, and took off and headed out east of town.
Remember Kirk Knox talking about the posse at the beginning of the episode?
They called out the whole city. They brought people from Cheyenne to go out there. They had the Civil Air Patrol. Ray Karpinski, the local police officer, put out an all-points bulletin. There's a picture in one of the newspapers of all these cars headed out looking for him. They did find his car. They found where he had hit a telephone pole and caused damage, and I think they found his hat on the ground there. He ended up in a field in a rancher's pasture, and his car was stuck, and so he left it and walked back into town and hid out in a house that was being built by the company who he worked for at the time. And he hid out overnight in that house. And then Richard Doctor, one of the other employees, came in to get a tube of caulk, and Tricky stepped out and asked him what he was doing there. And through the conversation with Richard Doctor and Tricky, Richard convinced him to turn himself in, went and got the county sheriff and Don Sherrard, the lawyer, and brought them to Tricky, and he turned himself in.
Tricky Riggle was convicted of double murder in a courthouse that was only a block or so away from the scene of his crimes and his house. He was given a death sentence and began to file appeals, but by 1957 they were exhausted, and the state began to gear up to use its only gas chamber in Rawlins.
They had put everybody on duty to carry out the execution. They had, I believe, moved Tricky to the death house, for lack of a better word.
About 13 hours before Riggle was supposed to die in the gas chamber, Governor Milward Simpson called Warden Miller in Rawlins, halting the execution.
He cites a Bible verse and says that he feels that Tricky is guilty, but he doesn't believe in capital punishment, and sends him to the pen to spend the rest of his life.
Some people say that Governor Simpson saving Riggle was the reason why he lost his 1958 bid for re-election. However, Robin's 2020 article, Milward Simpson and the Death Penalty, is linked in the description, and it says that other factors were also in play during that election, such as Simpson reducing veterans' benefits regarding property taxes. He also officially cracked down on gambling in Jackson, Wyoming, which, according to Robin's article, for a long time had been ignored or even condoned sometimes because it was conducive to tourism. In 1963, about 6 years after Riggle avoided the gas chamber, he was transferred to the Honor Farm in Riverton, Wyoming. The Honor Farm is what it sounds like, a place where prisoners grow crops and raise animals. Even to this day, much of the area where inmates work doesn't have anything keeping inmates in more than a 4-foot barbed wire fence.
In many ways, Tricky could be your star prisoner. They allowed variety shows, and so he was able to get up and do his rope act in front of people at the prison.
Well, at the Honor Farm, the warden gave Tricky a Pomeranian dog, which he trained to perform, and was even given a colt by one of the deputy wardens, which he also trained.
And then also he traveled around to other institutions, such as the state hospital, the boys' school, the girls' school, that type of thing, and put on shows.
On the Honor Farm, it's very unlikely that Riggle had any access to guns or much to alcohol either. I wonder if he ever enjoyed his time on the farm, getting to now just focus on working with animals.
He developed diabetes and had a leg amputated, so he was on crutches and in a wheelchair. And then as his health deteriorated, they transferred him to the state hospital for care there, and that's where he passed in 1981.
Tricky requested to be buried in Rock Springs, while Francis Williamson is buried in Laramie, and Walter Ackerblade was buried in Wheatland. Milward Simpson, who had lost re-election as governor, went on to serve as a U.S. Senator from 1962 to 1967. The cafe where the murders took place and the Top Hat Bar have all closed, but the buildings that held them remain, now replaced with other businesses.
I don't know why they didn't talk about it. I don't know if it was a crime that they wanted to forget, or if it was just they figured it was a love triangle and it's over and done, and I don't know.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day. I want to make sure to thank Robin Everett for her interview. Please check out the articles that she's written. They're linked in the description. A big shout out again to Mark Youngie, who recorded the interview with Kirk Knox. If you enjoy this program and want to hear more of it, please do a search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day. Every day is 2 words in this case, podcast, and you can listen to all of the past episodes for free. Thank you again for joining us. I should have a new episode to you in about 2 weeks.